Hi everyone, I'm Kevin, and this is HFX by Bike, a channel all about getting around Halifax by bike. I made a video a while back showing off the Devonshire painted bike lanes in the north end of the peninsula. For a recap, Devonshire has a pair of 1 kilometer long, 7.6 meter wide, one-way roads separated by medium and climbing between Barrington and Duffiss. The cross-section looks something kind of like this, although it varies a bit from place to place. There were a number of issues that I identified in the video, and so I'm going to try to address them in a hypothetical redesign of the street space. The biggest thing I want to do is improve the separation of cars and bikes along this stretch of road. Part of that is going to come from doing things like discouraging parking in the bike lanes and removing the door zone design. So that means no more being sandwiched between parked cars and moving traffic. I'd also like to simplify the 5-way intersection at Duffiss and Devonshire if that's at all possible. Devonshire is an interesting place for this kind of a rethink because it's so overbuilt for the number of cars actually moving through the area. For some history, circa 2014, Devonshire had 2 wide traffic lanes running in each direction and no parking or bike lanes. This was way more capacity than the road ever actually needed, and so 1 lane on each side was split between parking and a bike lane, and some traffic calming measures were added at intersections. That was definitely an improvement, but let's see if we can't move the ball forward a little. Okay, so here's the overhead view of Devonshire, split into 3 sections to make the visualization a little bit easier. We have our 5-way intersection at the top, with painted bike lanes on each side shown in green. The bike lanes get squished between the parking, which is shown in blue, and fast-moving traffic. There's a smooth transition between the bike lanes and the multi-use path at Barrington in the inbound direction, but when climbing Devonshire, you theoretically have to dismount and cross the street before proceeding, which is obviously inconvenient, so that's what we're starting with. For the first approach, I'll map out how to upgrade the existing painted lanes into barrier-protected lanes while trying to knock off as many of the original goals as possible. Just to get it out of the way, I'll start at the top of the street and address the 5-way intersection. I'm going to make it a single-lane roundabout. You're probably thinking, there's no way that the city would ever consider that, but you'd actually be wrong. The city was already planning a roundabout for this intersection all the way back in 2010. Similar roundabouts were built along North Park Street, but the one along Devonshire and Duffiss was cancelled due to pushback from local residents. I still think it makes the most sense for this space in terms of cyclist and pedestrian safety and comfort, as well as making trips through the area safer and more convenient for drivers. So I'm going to put it into this approach. I didn't map it out, but this kind of design also frees up a lot of road space to put in things like bike lanes to head further north or even west towards mainland Halifax. But that's a bit out of scope for today's video. Moving down Devonshire, I'm going to add a physical barrier on the edge of each of the bike lanes. That's going to eat up a little bit of a space, about a ½ meter, but that's okay because I'm also going to narrow the traffic lanes down from 3.4 meters down to 3 meters. That won't present any issues since even things like mail delivery trucks and buses can comfortably fit in the lane that wide. I'm also going to swap the positions of the parking and bike lanes, since the barrier-protected lanes would block any parking action, and being sandwiched between cars and moving traffic is uncomfortable and unsafe for cyclists. There might be some concerns about having the parking lane be directly next to traffic, and the potential for it to cause a conflict point, but I think this can be solved by adding a painted barrier, something like, say, 0.3 meters, between the two. The space could come out of the bike lane, which is currently 1.8 meters, which would bring it down to 1.5 meters, which is the minimum that the city recommends in its design guidelines. This is a pretty good trade-off for a protected lane, although it would be kind of obnoxious because the ability to pass people in the lane would be pretty minimal. And the last thing I'd do for this approach would be to convert the crosswalk at the Barrington intersection into either a cross ride or an extension of the multi-use path. I would mostly prefer the latter. There's still a bit of a conflict point there in terms of cars turning off of Barrington on Devonshire, but I think at least it would formalize this process a little bit. Here's the cross-section for the original street, which is what we have today, and here's the cross-section with the improvements I've just mentioned added in. I think that basically everything in this approach could be implemented on an interim basis pretty quickly, with the roundabout notwithstanding. Okay, for the second approach, I'm going to combine the 2 bike lanes into a single bidirectional lane. I'm going to run it along the southern side of the road because I think there's fewer intersections and fewer disruptions in general to deal with. The roundabout is going to stay in place from the first approach, so I won't spend a ton of time on it, but otherwise a lot of things are going to change. Combining the 2 lanes onto one side of the street eliminates the option of on-street parking for that side, even with the traffic lanes narrowed to 3 meters. There's some extra space on the side with the bike lane, So the barrier could be converted into a kind of second median to allow for the planting of some additional greenery or whatever else would improve the space. On the opposite side of the street, the painted bike lane can just be removed, and that opens up a bit of extra space. So we can have parking along that side of the street and even have a generous buffer with that and the traffic lane. I would tend to use any remaining space for additional greenery, except for between Hanover and Barrington, where there's no sidewalk, so we should just install one. The barrier for the bidirectional lane would run into the same issue as the one-way lane on the same side of the street. Namely, there would need to be gaps for private driveway access, and to accommodate this, we would actually need to put bollards inside of the lane itself, just to avoid people trying to drive down or park inside of the lane. At the intersection with Barrington, the transition between the multi-use path and the bike lane would now be seamless because they're effectively the same thing, and there wouldn't be any conflict points anymore. Going back to the cross sections, here's the street we have now, and here's what it would look like with a bidirectional bike lane installed. Just like with the one-way lanes, I think this approach could be implemented pretty quickly on an interim basis. The biggest barrier to this would be that it would be a lot harder to integrate with existing traffic flows without adding in the roundabout, but overall I think this is pretty doable. Okay, so the last approach is a bit of a departure from anything else in the city, but it fully leans into the fact that there's a lot of excess road space on Devonshire. I'm going to take the entire southern side of the street and convert it into a bikeway, but like a good bikeway. Starting at Duffus, I have the roundabout in place and it transitions directly onto the bikeway. The bikeway itself covers the entire span of the curb from the existing median on the south side, and traffic lanes have both been moved over to the northern side and separated by their own small median to prevent head-on collisions. The bikeway would be divided by bollards into a series of relatively small sections, with gaps in the median being used by cars to access each section. This would enable access to private driveways and even allow for on-street parking along the entire south side of the street. With each section only having a gap at the top or the bottom, and linking only to the outbound lane, cars would default to entering at the top of the section and exiting at the bottom. The short sections would discourage rapid acceleration by cars, if only because there's nowhere to go. The bikeway would be about 7.6 meters wide, which gives drivers a troubling amount of room to get creative. To combat this, it might be worthwhile to put some bollards about 2 meters away from the median barrier, and this would give cyclists moving up Devonshire in the outbound direction a clear space to move uphill without any interaction with cars at all, whereas those moving downhill would occasionally interact with those either coming out of driveways or leaving the parking area. With all of the bike traffic loaded onto a single side of Devonshire, I would be inclined to limit access to some of the intersecting streets along the bikeway. I have some mocked up on the diagram, but I would take as many as I can get away with. Just like with the bidirectional bike lane, the bikeway would transition smoothly onto the multi-use path at Barrington. Back at the cross sections, here's what it looks like today, and here's what the Devonshire bikeway would look like. Unlike the bike lanes, this approach would be a lot harder to implement on an interim basis because it would require modifying the median. I think how well this would work would be based on how much demand for street parking there is on Devonshire. It would struggle if there were a lot of cars moving in and out of those walled off sections. So those are 3 ways to fix the painted bike lanes on Devonshire Avenue. I think approach 1 could be implemented more or less immediately, even without addressing the Duffus intersection. Approach 2 could escalate from there, as long as the intersection were addressed in some way, even if it's not with a roundabout. And I think approach 3 could work really well, but it's definitely a departure from anything the city has done before. Let me know how you would fix Devonshire in the comments. As always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.